Full military honors, a final tribute to a brother in arms. The virtues of duty and honor, of bravery and sacrifice, are realized in many ways. Not always on the battlefield or in the cockpit, but sometimes far removed from the view of history and public recognition. In lonely vigils and dangerous excursions into the depths of human treachery and deceit, where victory is judged by the weight of indisputable fact and failure is only a headline away. The celebrations marking the end of the Second World War also signaled fundamental changes for the U.S. military. In 1947, the Department of Defense was established, and along with it, a new service. W. Stuart Symington was sworn in as the first Secretary of the Air Force. The long-cherished goal of air power advocates was finally realized. Military and civilian leaders were faced with the daunting task of establishing the new service, while defining its role within new geopolitical realities.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
Expediency dictated borrowing from the Army's organizational structure, including a decentralized investigative system. This included the Air Inspector, the Criminal Investigation Division, CID, and the Counterintelligence Corps, CIC.
They knew their business, they were professional, but there was no central direction to them. They were under the control, under the thumb of base authorities.
Implementation of the Army investigative system was interrupted by revelations concerning wartime procurement improprieties. Major General Bennett Myers, who was in charge of purchasing for all Army Air Forces equipment, had allegedly used his access to millions of dollars worth of contracts for personal gain. The continuing parade of witnesses grilled by the Senate Special Committee pointed inexorably to General Myers' culpability. They also exposed the inadequacies of the Army's investigative procedures.
There was a CID unit at Wright-Patterson. There was also a CIC unit. Neither of those units were centrally controlled at that time. They were subordinate to the authorities on the base. It turned out that each of these two organizations had inklings of General Myers' involvement in his illegal activity, and they were working independently, not coordinating with each other on it.
The committee's report of April 1948 characterized the Myers investigation as confused and haphazard. It further recommended that the Air Force initiate a centralized investigative system along the lines of the FBI. Secretary Symington requested from FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover the loan of his special assistant, Joseph F. Carroll, with whom Symington had worked previously. A career FBI special agent, it would be Carroll's job to shape the new investigative agency. His overriding concerns were independence and impartiality. His guiding principle, centralization. Additional FBI personnel were brought over to staff key positions.
I had a conversation with him one day, and I told him that I was thinking of leaving the FBI and going with CIA because I had received an offer from CIA to go to their counterintelligence activity. And I told him I wasn't sure whether that's really where I wanted to go. And he mentioned to me that there was some opportunity in the Air Force with what was to be created and known as OSI, and would I consider it, and I did.
I had no reservations about leaving the FBI and going with a new organization like the Office of Special Investigations, because Carroll assured me that it was going to be a first-class organization, and I had every confidence in him in that respect.
One of the things that Carroll had in mind at the time he came over from the FBI, he recognized that in addition to bringing many top men from the FBI with him, he needed some military people with good, broad experience in the military in the investigative field. Lieutenant Colonel John Murray was chief of the General Investigation Division, or Criminal Division.
Though not within the scope of his original mandate, Carroll, with approval from Hoover, was convinced to go on active duty to become the new agency's first director. In May 1948, Carroll was commissioned as a brigadier general. Within 3 months, on August 1st, the Office of Special Investigations became operational.
There had never been an investigative organization in the military set up on the lines of OSI and encompassing all the things that OSI did and still does.
As former CID and CIC personnel were integrated into OSI's ranks, standardized training became a priority. An 8-week OSI training school was established at the Washington, D.C. National Guard Armory. The bulk of OSI's early investigative efforts were put into personnel security background checks. Many special agents considered them a kind of probationary exercise, but there was never a shortage of subjects.
The Army CIC had left us 2 filing cabinets stuffed full of cases they hadn't even touched, and these covered Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire. One time I got chased off a back porch by a woman with a mop. I showed her my credentials and had my picture on there, and she looked at it and says, "Never saw him in my life," and picked up a mop, chased me off the back porch. So this isn't for me. Then I got orders to go to Japan. In the OSI then, general investigations covered just about everything there was.
Overseas, OSI units were initially placed under the Major Command's Inspector General.
In the early days, base commanders, before they got the word, were a little reluctant to have an investigative agency on their base that they, number one, didn't know the grades of the people or ranks. They had no control over them, and they attempted several times to push these people around a little bit, make things rough for them. Stuck them in old buildings out in the outskirts of the base somewhere, and make it hard for them to get vehicle maintenance for their cars and this kind of thing.
It would not be until 1962, with the consolidation of overseas directorates, that OSI achieved the true worldwide centralization envisioned by General Carroll. In Korea, the lessons of unpreparedness were painfully driven home. The American military rearmed. Air bases took shape in far-flung corners of the world. OSI fraud investigation efforts were directed at countless construction projects and service clubs.
Our emphasis was in finding out who was the culprit and establishing enough facts so that he could be tried or punished.
Ironically, OSI was locked out of the process that had fostered its very creation, procurement. By civil statute, this was still the province of civilian agencies. But by the 1970s, the arms race was producing weapons of enormous complexity and cost. OSI was becoming increasingly involved in procurement matters, feeling its way case by case. Investigations concerning the F-111 fighter resulted in several prosecutions, including the use of out-of-date parachute material for its sophisticated egress system.
That's the first time we started figuring out that you had to go from the base out to the contractor and work in the contractor's plant to really define and make these investigations. There was a case involving the F-111 gas tanks. This case resulted in our first major recovery of money, $100,000, which in those days we thought was a big recovery. But it was a first. We did recover money from this company.
Statutory barriers limiting OSI's access to contractors were removed in 1982, and soon after, OSI special agents were placed directly in production plants.
We had a lot of frustration in getting the agents in there because the contracting people felt that they would be blockers. But as the agents moved in and got involved with the people, the commanders became proponents of what we were doing and looked forward to having our agents in plants.
OSI's fraud investigation mission was further refined in 1987, following an in-house bottoms-up review.
What we ended up doing was recommending changes to the entire structure of OSI, or at least portions of the structure of OSI, in that we would create detachments or subunits of detachments that had nothing but focus on central systems fraud.
We would not count open cases as our scorecard anymore. We would count recoveries, indictments, and convictions. What that did is it released the agents from continuing to run a bunch of these old cases that weren't going anyplace. Now, if we go to U.S. Attorney, we brief him or her, and they tell us what their feeling on the case is. If they say, do these investigative steps and come back, we do that. If they say, close it, we close it.
In 1987, an investigation of Northrop Corporation involved critical components for several major weapons systems, including the air-launched cruise missile and the MX Peacekeeper. It would become a milestone for OSI Central Systems.
I became chief of the government fraud section, the U.S. Attorney's Office, in about the end of 1986. And in the first year or so that I was doing that, I think my contact with OSI was probably quite minimal. But I began to work with them after we had these allegations at Northrop.
When I introduced myself to Bill, showed him my badge credentials, he thought we were part of the FBI. And it was a bit of an educational process, that first meeting, for me to explain to Bill that the fact that we were the investigative arm for the Air Force, that we did have a legitimate criminal investigative role to play, and that in fact we were the controlling agents for these 11 investigations we had targeted against Northrop Corporation.
I think OSI was determined to make an impact with this case, to work it very hard, to give it a very thorough effort and a very complete commitment to it in terms of manpower.
A multi-agency task force was assembled, interviewing hundreds of witnesses and processing tons of subpoenaed and seized documents. OSI was the leader, providing the majority of the agents and investigative resources.
Northrop had a very firm attitude about not admitting to any improprieties on these weapons systems. And only after having spent several days choosing a jury, when I think Northrop realized that the government had its act together, we had the evidence, the witnesses, a judge that was going to allow us to put on the case, did Northrop offer to resolve it.
Northrop paid over $17 million in criminal fines and over $8 million in civil settlements. 1,000 cruise missiles were brought up to performance specifications.
The government got its check 30 days later. Northrop had no appeal. And at the time, it was the largest penalty assessed against a defense contractor in the nation's history.
When you look at the Northrop Task Force and all the problems they went through to get started, it was really the catalyst that brought the military federal investigative services together to combat fraud. We learned a lot of lessons, and we've taken those lessons, and now we have a very good in-place task force that can handle any big case that ever comes up.
The interview teams will be broken up, having DCIS and NIS. We're going to be staging people within manufacturing and in reception to keep an eye on the total control of the search as it progresses.
The reward for me, and I think I can speak for other agents, is what you recoup. And when you have a copy of that check in your hand, you just feel proud. You're feeling good about yourself and your accomplishment of the team and the other agents that actually helped to recoup this money.
Counterintelligence at that time was in the intelligence department of the Air Force, and General Carroll was reluctant to take that over because he wasn't quite sure that that was in his mandate. Subsequently, but very reluctantly, the Air Force gave counterintelligence to OSI. We initially try to wean them away from the CID and the CIC type activity and try to convert them more to how FBI agents operated.
In Europe, in USAFE, in the 1950s, OSI also ran positive intelligence missions into the Soviet zone of Germany. And many of them were nothing but bicycle riders who rode past the air bases trying to count airplanes. And I think that was largely the same sort of threat that we faced in the early 1950s in West Germany also.
The threat changed. Air Force personnel were increasingly targeted by hostile intelligence as the Soviets tightened their grip on Eastern Europe. OSI and USAFE resorted to a more offensive program to counter this espionage. By 1961, when the wall went up in Berlin, OSI had developed an effective double agent program in Germany.
Berlin was very disturbing because at that time you could see people on the east side trying to communicate with people on the west side shouting, and you could only assume that there were children, parents, brothers, sisters, all calling to each other. And you could see on the eastern side, the officials pulling them away from the wall so they couldn't communicate.
Working quietly behind the scenes, OSI participated in some of the Cold War's most dramatic moments, including secret exchanges of espionage agents and prisoners at the so-called Freedom Bridge between East and West Germany.
OSI in Berlin, over the years, provided an enormous amount of support, security support to those exchanges. And in fact, I recall one instance where an OSI man was actually the driver of the car that moved one of the main defectors out of that particular area.
As the tempo of CI operations increased during the 1960s, OSI sought to establish a tightly controlled long-term cadre of special agents with counterintelligence expertise. With the help of the Central Intelligence Agency, Project Diogenes was initiated.
CIA was asked to develop a specialized training program in the counterintelligence function. The fact that the agency was willing to develop this counterintelligence course exclusively and specifically for OSI represents probably quite a turn in relationship between the two agencies, if you will.
Ms. Gordon, in addition to all...
OSI's double agent program remained active against the Soviets and the Warsaw Pact. A number of successful operations were even brought back to the United States.
We almost never used foreign nationals as principals in those operations. So that gave us the capability of establishing an operation maybe in Germany and bringing it to the United States, or then sending it to Southeast Asia over a long period of time. And many of those operations ran anywhere from 6 to 8 to 10 years.
Air Force policy regarding U.S. citizens caught spying for the enemy has always been to prosecute, not turn the individual. Sergeant Jeffrey Carney, who defected in 1985 with military secrets, became the subject of relentless pursuit by OSI's Berlin detachment. Approval to apprehend Carney in 1991 culminated in around-the-clock surveillance in the heart of East Berlin.
It took total commitment, because everything that could go wrong in that surveillance did. The radios, the communications went out. The weather went south on us real quick, and we couldn't find Sergeant Carney.
After 4 exhausting days, the effort paid off.
Sergeant Carney came out onto the balcony of his residence. At that point, it was 7 o'clock in the evening. He never came out of his apartment until 9 o'clock the next morning. I walked up to him, and you could see he was very, very surprised and nervous. And I just asked him his name. I said, Carney?
The detachment had been briefed by the OSI clinical psychologist on Carney's expected behavior.
He really nailed it. Sergeant Carney gave no resistance at all. There's not going to be another place like Berlin. That's where the game was really played. It was a premier counterintelligence detachment.
Our CI mission here in Europe has changed dramatically with the end of the Cold War, and we face a wide array of challenges. In our case, providing anti-terrorism collections, protective service details, special investigative operations in the counterintelligence world.
These heavily armored Mercedes are the calling card of one of OSI's most specialized units, Detachment 501, the only full-time protective service detail in the Air Force. All its members are special agents.
Every time you leave the office, you have to be on your toes, you have to know what you're doing, and you have to be confident in yourself. Whenever the Commander of the United States Air Forces Europe goes to any given location throughout the European theater, we send special agents out to the field to coordinate with counterpart agencies to ensure protective services provided at those areas. Plus, we will send a team of special agents in with the protectee to ensure his personal safety. When one of these vehicles is fully armored out, we're talking anywhere between 5,800 to 6,000 pounds of total gross weight on the vehicle, which is another reason why we use Mercedes-Benz here in Europe, because it provides a great solid platform for carrying that much extra weight around. It's a team-intensive effort. Unlike most of your duties as an OSI agent, you have to be team-oriented.
Since 1948, virtually anything we do and have done in the counterintelligence program has contributed to the security of United States Air Force materiel and people around the world.
As U.S. foreign policy objectives encompass regional conflicts and humanitarian intervention, commanders increasingly rely on OSI's CI resources.
When Air Force units deploy, there are basically three areas that we try and advise them on. One is foreign intelligence services, which bad guys may be out there trying to steal secrets, stuff like that. The second are terrorists, those ones who may be trying to use whatever acts of violence to hurt our forces. And the third is routine criminality.
A more recent development, and an area of great concern to OSI, is the trafficking of radioactive and biological materials.
If we think those types of threats are being moved, or being forwarded through unconventional types of activities, the behind the streets dealing, that's the type of stuff that you need an investigator for, and that's what OSI tries to come in and do.
The foundation upon which we build all our counterintelligence and anti-terrorism programs is based upon the relationships that we establish with host country counterparts.
Dienst mit AF OSI. Und OSI hat sich mir immer als ein fairer, vertrauensvoller Partner. Das ist das Besondere an der Zusammenarbeit in Verbindung mit meiner persönlichen Erfahrung.
The military is a microcosm of our society. There's really no difference between criminal investigation in the military and criminal investigations in any community. One small group of people, and they represent all walks of life, good guys and bad guys.
Air Force members as a whole are a little bit better educated. They are a little bit more dedicated to some type of organizational pattern or belief. However, they are still human beings, and human beings make mistakes. Human beings commit crimes.
In order to do the job of investigations well, to be good at it, you need to be able to draw on all kinds of resources. And forensics is one part of it. This is the application of scientific principles to the investigative process.
OSI likes to have an autopsy whenever there's a death of a military member or dependent. We recently had a case of a 16-year-old dependent that had a gunshot wound to the chest. On the face of it, it appeared as if he was a suicide victim. You don't know further until you get into the autopsy. If it didn't affect you on an emotional level, I'm not sure you'd be human. The thing is, you have to get beyond that emotion and realize that what you're doing is for a legitimate purpose and a legitimate investigation to make a determination of whether or not this is a homicide, a suicide, or an accidental death. An autopsy is important because it's the person's last opportunity to tell you what happened.
Ramstein Air Base, Germany. Here in 1982, every resource available to OSI was mobilized to solve a heinous on-base murder. It would become an investigative benchmark.
I think the thing that made the Nittler case the most unique was the extreme savagery of the crime itself. We see a number of homicides and quite a few suicides. They tend to fall within relatively normal parameters, and this one fell outside of it. This happened at Ramstein Air Force Base in the Civil Engineering Squadron. One of the workers came in at about 6:30 in the morning and looked in the service call area and noticed simultaneously that the girl who was supposed to be working wasn't there and that there was a blood trail on the floor. And he followed the blood trail to the end and found her body.
Agents in Ramstein and from other surrounding locations in Germany mustered their forces and did the good job. They had 2 safes filled with data, and there was the problem.
6 months later, when we hadn't made any substantial progress in terms of identifying a subject, then the general sent a team of 3 people over to see if we could assist the detachment. What we did is we took that information and tried to see what meaning we could divine from it.
We put together a psychological profile which, if memory serves me correctly, had 19 elements. That was the kind of information which started to make the suspect list a lot smaller instead of looking for virtually anyone in central Germany.
Blood spatter analysis was very important. When the investigators went in, they saw the office furniture, they saw a cot. The cot was on the floor, on its legs, facing up in its normal position. And yet there were blood stains and blood spatters on the walls and along the baseboards, indicating that a terrific struggle had taken place there. And this turned out to be critically important.
An analysis of blood stains on the cot showed that a clotting pattern had occurred where it had at some time been tipped on its side while bloody.
The only person who could have known that the cot had been on its side was the killer. So when he said he'd been in the room and seen the cot tipped over, we knew he was our guy. This particular case was a watershed because it taught us to look at these kinds of cases differently than we had in the past. It's no longer simply a question of trying to gather all the data possible. It's a question of trying to gather the right kinds of data, social, psychological, forensic, and so on, and then correlating them quickly and carefully.
OSI really has been making pioneer efforts across a spectrum of specialties in law enforcement. If you look at the big picture, we have had resources here in OSI and enjoy the availability of resources that most law enforcement agencies couldn't even dream of having. And then we have these regionally posited or worldwide available. If you think of all the places that we serve, it's a remarkable system.
I came to Washington in 1978 to become director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It wasn't long after that that I met some of the key organizations with whom the FBI worked closely. And of course, one of those was Office of Special Investigations of the Air Force. And I found very quickly that the OSI had the same basic standards of professionalism and integrity. Integrity is important not only in terms of professional responsibility, but also how the people in this country think about those who have been given large amounts of authority and responsibility for their protection. They want to know that, that agents, whether they're OSI or FBI, are thoroughly honest, cannot be compromised, will carry out their responsibilities as they are given to them, possess the independence not to be politicized, and at the same time the responsibility to carry out legitimate orders as given. It's character, and it's something that I suppose we cannot create, but we can foster and protect and reinforce.
An investigation is an intensely personal process. I go to a scene and I find a person who's been hurt or who's been killed. Nobody speaks for that person. Their days are over. We represent the system We represent justice if any is going to be found. And if we demur, if we step aside, if we fail to do our job to the best of our ability, there is no justice. I'm offended by these crimes. I'm offended by what people do. And to the extent that it's my responsibility to catch them, I'm going to catch them.
In the span of one generation, the Air Force has emerged as a power of global reach. Its brief history has been shaped and formed by the ebb and flow of world events, the fall of empires, and acts of mortal folly. Through it all, the men and women of the Air Force Office of Special Investigations have never wavered from their fundamental values. The organization's transcendent qualities, integrity, impartiality, and professionalism, have guided it through the buffeting winds of change. Total commitment and countless hours, OSI has always been there, in the shadows of history.